In 1851, a fire destroyed more recorded knowledge than any event since the Library of Alexandria. Most people have never heard of it. The Smithsonian Institution lost 35,000 artifacts. The National Institute lost its entire collections. But the real loss, the one that changed American economic history, happened in a building most history books barely mention: the Patent Office. On December 15th, 1836, another fire had already destroyed the original Patent Office, taking with it the documentation of every patent issued in the United States from 1790 to 1836. Nearly 10,000 patents gone. Models, specifications, drawings. The government spent years trying to reconstruct what was lost. By 1851, they had recovered only fragments. Then on September 24th, 1851, the rebuilt Patent Office caught fire again. This time, they saved the building. But what burned changed everything. I came to this story through a patent, or rather the absence of one. My grandfather designed a water pump in 1847 that his family swears was revolutionary. Simple, elegant, no moving parts to break. He applied for a patent. There is no record it was ever issued. I spent months searching. What I found instead was a gap, a systematic gap, in American innovation records that nobody talks about. And the more I looked, the more I realized the gap wasn't accidental. The Patent Office fire of 1851 destroyed something specific, not the building, not the catalogue, something they don't emphasize in the official reports. It destroyed the interference records. When multiple inventors applied for patents on similar ideas, the Patent Office maintained detailed files documenting who invented what first, who filed when, who had working prototypes. These interference cases were how the office determined priority. The 1851 fire took most of them. What survived tells us something uncomfortable. Before 1851, independent inventors, farmers, craftsmen, small workshops, they filed the majority of American patents. After 1851, the pattern shifts. Corporate patent holders begin to dominate, not gradually, sharply. Patent historian B. Zorina Khan's data, published by the National Bureau of Economic Research, shows that by 1860, corporate entities held patent portfolios that would have been impossible to assemble under the old interference system. Because under that system, you had to prove you invented it first. After the records burned, you just had to prove you filed first. And if you had the money for lawyers, you could file dozens of variations on the same basic idea, flooding the system, choking out individual inventors who couldn't afford to fight. Here's what I keep coming back to. The Patent Office was rebuilt in fireproof materials after the 1836 fire: stone, brick, iron. The 1851 fire started in a wooden partition installed during renovations, a temporary structure inside a fireproof building. The official report, archived at the National Archives, attributes the fire to defective flue construction in the temporary wooden model room. A wooden room inside a fireproof building housing the exact records that documented who really invented what. I spent weeks trying to understand why they built it that way. What I found wasn't about architecture. Let me show you the timing. The Patent Office fire happens on September 24, 1851. 7 months earlier, on February 27, 1851, Congress had passed the most significant patent reform in American history, the Patent Act of 1851. It reduced patent fees from $30 to $15 for American citizens. It extended patent terms. It made patents easier to file, easier to transfer, easier to sell. The official history tells us this was about democratizing innovation, making patents accessible to ordinary Americans. But here's what the law actually did. It created the first American patent assignment market. Before 1851, most inventors worked their own patents. After 1851, patents became commodities. You could file a patent and immediately sell it to someone with manufacturing capacity. Patent brokers emerged as a profession. Corporate patent portfolios became investment vehicles. The interference records, the documentation proving who actually invented what first, burned 7 months after the law made patents tradable assets. I keep finding these patterns. March 3rd, 1849, 2 years before the fire, Congress creates the Department of the Interior. One of its first acts is transferring control of the Patent Office from the State Department to Interior. New department, new administrators, new priorities. The Commissioner of Patents in 1851 was Thomas Ewbank, appointed in 1849. His annual report from 1849, available through the Library of Congress, contains a phrase I cannot stop thinking about. He wrote that the patent system must evolve to serve the needs of capital formation and industrial consolidation, not invention, capital formation. Before Ewbank, the Patent Office existed to protect inventors. Under Ewbank, it existed to enable investment. The wooden model room was constructed during his tenure. The fire happened on his watch. The interference records, the proof of who invented what first, burned under his administration. Sometimes I wonder if I'm seeing connections that aren't there. Maybe the fire was just a fire, but then I look at what happened to the inventors whose interference records burned. The National Archives holds patent litigation records from 1852 to 1860. The pattern is consistent. Independent inventors filing infringement suits against corporate patent holders, claiming prior invention, and losing. Not because they couldn't prove they invented it first, but because the interference records that would have proven it were gone. The courts ruled again and again that without official Patent Office documentation, prior invention claims failed, and the documentation had burned. Let me give you one example. In 1853, a Vermont machinist named Elias Howe Jr. sued Singer Manufacturing for stealing his sewing machine design. Howe had filed for a patent in 1846, 5 years before Singer's 1851 filing. The interference records would have shown this clearly, but those records burned. The case dragged on for 4 years. Singer had lawyers, money, time. Howe was a working machinist. He won only because he had kept personal documentation. The Patent Office records couldn't help him. They were gone. And Howe was one of the few who could afford to fight. How many couldn't? There's another gap I cannot ignore. The Patent Office maintained assignment books showing who sold patents to whom. The books from 1836 to 1850 are remarkably complete. The books from 1851 to 1855 are fragmented. Large sections are missing. The Library of Congress notes that certain volumes were never transferred from the Patent Office. They existed, they were referenced, but they were never archived. Where did they go? I keep returning to one transaction. On November 2nd, 1852, 13 months after the fire, a patent holding company called American Machine Works acquired 47 patents in a single purchase. 47 patents covering agricultural machinery, textile processing, metal fabrication. The purchase price was $8,900. The inventors were 23 different individuals spread across 7 states. How did one corporation acquire 47 patents from 23 inventors in a single transaction? The assignment books that would tell us are missing. But we know it happened. The patents still exist, reassigned to American Machine Works, all on the same day, all for less than $200 per patent. The official narrative tells us this was progress, consolidation into efficient corporate hands. But the furniture my grandfather's generation built, made by craftsmen who held their own patents, that furniture still stands. The factories built by corporations holding patent portfolios acquired after 1851, those factories are gone. Here's what disturbs me. They rebuilt the Patent Office model room in 1852, right after the fire. This time they used fireproof materials throughout. Iron, brick, stone, no wood. It never burned again. The building still stands today, the Smithsonian American Art Museum. You can walk through the rooms where the 1851 fire burned. There are plaques explaining the history. None of them mention the interference records. None of them mention the assignment books. None of them ask why a fireproof building had a wooden room containing the most important documentation in American patent law. I asked a Smithsonian historian about this once. He said the wooden construction was simply cheaper for storing models, except the interference files were stored there too, and they were proof proof that made it hard to steal patents from individual inventors. There's a Supreme Court case that makes this explicit. Pennock versus Dialogue, 1829, established that public use before patent filing could invalidate the patent. This created vulnerability for inventors who publicly demonstrated their work. The Patent Act of 1851 reduced that vulnerability, but only if you could prove prior invention through interference records. When those records burned, the precedent became a weapon. Corporate filers could argue that independent inventors claiming prior invention had engaged in public use, invalidating their claim. Without interference records, the argument worked. I don't have smoking gun evidence. I have timing, incentive, and outcome. The Patent Act makes patents tradable. 7 months later, records proving who invented what burn. Within 5 years, corporate patent portfolios dominate. Within 10 years, independent inventors file only 23% of new patents, down from 71% in 1850. The transition point is the fire. Sometimes I think about the Library of Alexandria. We remember it as tragedy. We don't remember that it burned multiple times and each burning served someone's interest. We mourn the loss but forget to ask who benefited. The Patent Office fire destroyed records, not knowledge. The inventors still knew what they invented. But without proof, knowledge becomes allegation. And allegations don't hold up against corporations with lawyers. The gap in my family history is small compared to what was lost. One water pump patent, probably never worth much in commercial terms, but my grandfather knew it worked. His neighbours knew it worked. They used pumps he built by hand for decades. He just couldn't prove he invented it after someone else patented a similar design in 1852 and threatened him with infringement suits if he kept building them. He stopped. Not because his pump didn't work, but because he couldn't afford to fight. How many others stopped? How many working innovations died because the records that would have protected them burned? I keep coming back to one image. The wooden model room, inside the fireproof building, housing paper records that proved priority. Why wood? Why temporary? Why there? The official reports say it was cheaper, faster, more flexible for storing the growing collection of patent models. But the Patent Office had requested funding for permanent fireproof model storage in 1848. Congress denied it. 3 years later, the temporary wooden room burned, taking the interference records with it. Congress immediately appropriated funds for permanent fireproof construction. Deny funding for protection, lose the records, appropriate funding for replacement. And what got replaced was a building. What didn't get replaced were the records proving who invented what first. The patents that survived tell us something uncomfortable. The 1851 fire damaged approximately 2,000 patent models and files. But the damage wasn't random. A 2013 analysis found that patents held by corporate entities were 3 times more likely to have complete surviving documentation than patents held by individual inventors. 3 times. Either the fire selectively burned files by ownership class, or someone saved certain records while letting others burn. Patent Office employees reported spending the night rescuing what they could. They prioritized based on value. But value to whom? The gap in my family history is small compared to what was lost. One water pump patent, probably never worth much in commercial terms, but my grandfather knew it worked. His neighbours knew it worked. They used pumps he built by hand for decades. He just couldn't prove he invented it after someone else patented a similar design in 1852 and threatened him with infringement suits if he kept building them. He stopped. Not because his pump didn't work, but because he couldn't afford to fight. How many others stopped? How many working innovations died because the records that would have protected them burned? I don't have answers, only patterns. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Why did the Patent Act of 1851, making patents tradable assets, pass 7 months before the fire destroyed the records proving who invented what? Why were interference records stored in a wooden room inside a fireproof building? Why did independent inventor patent filings collapse from 71% to 23% in the decade after the fire? Why were the patent assignment books from 1851 to 1855 never transferred to the National Archives? Why did corporate patent portfolios emerge fully formed in the years immediately following? Why does every history of American innovation treat the 1851 fire as a footnote, barely worth mentioning, when it marked the exact point where American invention stopped being individual and became corporate? The Library of Alexandria burned, and we lost ancient knowledge. The Patent Office burned, and we lost proof of who knew what when. Both times what burned determined what could be claimed. Both times someone benefited from the forgetting. We remember Alexandria as tragedy. We don't remember 1851 at all. Maybe that's the point.